I am a freelance cultural journalist and critic from the UK. I contribute to a number of publications, including The Stage, The Guardian, BBC Culture, and I'm also the editor of C-Stage, which is an English language platform which covers theatre and performance in South East Europe. On the panel with me today, I have Ulricha, who is the Managing Director of Swedish Performing Arts Coalition, which is also the Swedish Centre of International Theatre Institute. In Sweden, this non-profit organisation gathers the whole industry, including the union, the employers' organisation and the artistic universities. The largest continuous projects are the Swedish Performing Arts now, where jury selected shows are shown during 6 days of 200 industry seminars. Sweat Stage, which is a marketplace for Swedish shows internationally, and Proud Performing Arts, a network and exchange platform to evolve and celebrate queer art and artists in the world. The focus is always towards artistic freedom, inclusion and equality. Ulricha is also a former actress and works as a translator of opera and musicals. We also have Mark Yeoman, who has been the artistic director of the Moderzon Festival in the Dutch city of Groningen since 2001, a festival presenting new international work from both emerging and established theatre makers. The festival has a strong social base as well as an artistic one, and is funded as being part of the official cultural infrastructure of the Netherlands. Since 2016, he is also artistic director of the Grand Theatre in Groningen, an indie theatre in the heart of the city that manages and curates work and presentation space for a mix of local and international artists. The focus is strongly on supporting autonomous development and creating continuity, support and stability for audiences as much as the makers. In his previous career, Mark has been an actor as well, a director and a producer, and has advised national Dutch bodies around new international tendencies and developing openings and opportunities. And finally, we have Pocek, who has been collaborating with Ljubljana's Play Theatre since 2010. She's a member of Play's Artistic Council and programming coordinator of the Tripney platform, developing projects connected to the internationalization and international cooperation. Between 2017 and 2022, she was a member of the board of directors of IETM, and in 2022, she took over the coordination of the network's Local Journeys for Change project and the Green School. She maintains a broad spectrum of activities, fostering connections between different social and professional communities. So we have this quite huge topic, which we are going to be exploring today, or attempting to kind of contextualize in various national and international contexts. I wanted to start with an example, or something that I thought was quite an interesting way to begin. So during the pandemic, when we were all sitting in our homes, in our apartments, not being able to go out, not being able to see live performance, a group of theatre makers in the UK to begin with, but I think it evolved into a bigger project, started something which we call the European Theatre Club. This involved every week streaming a particular show that was being hosted by theatre websites, maybe from the Schouwwoon or from National Theatre Ghent, and then theatre makers and anyone else who was interested were watching the show at the same time together and communicating on social media their thoughts and reflections on the show, and it became a really interesting improvised form of sort of dialogue and cultural exchange. But I'm quite drawn to this idea of the European Theatre Club and what is meant by that, and what that club both includes and excludes. It's like we chose this name in a kind of without thinking too much about what that means, but like we were watching certain kinds of performances which we had deemed European as UK theatre makers. So I thought that was a nice way to sort of have a springboard to think about what European theatre means and what different theatres mean. So when we talk about German theatre, when we talk about French theatre, Scandinavian theatre, the Balkan theatre, we're usually using this as a kind of shorthand, and that includes certain kinds of directorial approaches, thematic preoccupations and aesthetic approaches. But once you dig a little bit deeper, it's interesting to sort of diagnose, what those are and where they come from. In the UK, there's a tendency, I find, for us to talk about UK theatre and European theatre as if they are separate things. And there has even been, like, sometimes we have one very prominent UK playwright, was talking about like European theatre as this contaminant that might, sully our texts with, too much directing or something along these lines. And also, when I'm attending the Edinburgh Festival, it's often a very good way of seeing like all the different sort of preoccupations, thematic concerns that are existing across Europe in one space, and being able to have this like overview. So I think it would be a really interesting opportunity for an international audience to get a sense of the chief thematic concerns, the topics that are at the sort of forefront of the theatre themes at the moment. What are theatre makers making work about? What kind of work are they making? And what factors you think are influencing the topics that are at the most sort of pressing edge of sort of the theatre cultures at the moment from your different perspectives? Maybe a small, short overview to begin with, and then we can dig a little bit deeper.
Oh no. Hello. Thank you for inviting me to this. It's a big topic, but we'll start somewhere. Explaining the Swedish theatre, or the Scandinavian theatre, I think there are parallel movements. We've had kind of a, Sweden is known for being very, we're used to very feministic concepts and direction, and when you do classics, it's always in a contemporary setting, and that goes also. I would say that the dance field and the performing arts, performance artists are like the avant-garde, and the independent theater makers are like following that stream, and then in the institutions we still see what they think that their core audience wants, which is male directors and very famous white actors in big parts. But we have also, I would say that, I don't know, am I too close or too far away? Is it a bit too loud? Okay. So I would say that the ones who can relate very freely to like doing what they want and being the most contemporary are the institutions working towards children and youth in Sweden, because you are not dependent on selling tickets to people who come at night, because you work up trust and you have these different tours. You work towards schools, so you can do basically very daring, modern, and very experimental things for children and youth. And I would say that our most fantastic directors and playwrights in Sweden, they work both with young audiences and adults. So it's not a hierarchical issue in Sweden if you get to direct a family performance or performance for young people. It's just as rewarding as to work like on the big stage at the Royal Dramatic for adults. So of course then we have this one movement that goes towards the even more experimental, which a lot of debaters call the left wing corridor. Like everything is politically correct, and it's like, what are you doing? Does everything have to be about menstruation or transgender, or it has like a kind of a useful, like you were saying also, stating that a lot of shows is about the climate change, and I don't agree with that, at least not in Sweden, but we do work a lot with climate aspects on the productions, like how can we reuse fabric and set designs and everything, but that's that part of it. So it's also, since we in Sweden recently we have also like an openly racist party that's part of our government, and they are very inexperienced as politicians because they grew very fast, this party. So they, in the cities and the regions, they have politicians, cultural politicians, who have no idea what arm length distance means, for instance, and they can like stop a reading or a production because it's promoting transgenders for children or whatever. So it's like a very weird place right now in Sweden. And also then we have the right-wing debaters who think that they are the new avant-garde, that it's you know, they are out in the cold because they are not. Like, so it's very, yeah, it's very polarized. I guess that goes for almost, like, raise your hand if you don't live in a polarized society. Sorry. Yeah, and so I think that what I sense is kind of yeah.
Think about it.
Yeah, Netherlands.
Yes.
Yeah. So there was also this research done by the employers' organization in Sweden about like how do you work with threats and censorship in productions, and the researcher only interviewed institutions. And they said that, well, it doesn't matter to us, it just brings us closer together as an ensemble, and when we do this play, and we know that we're doing the right thing. And then it's like, but what about the freelance playwright who gets threats to their door, or freelance director or actor, and they're not in the institution anymore because they have gone home. So it's like this big gray zone. And this researcher also asked in his questionnaire if anyone had practiced self-censorship, and everyone said no, because who would admit that? So I think that's kind of a thing we need to be very sensitive to, because I can't imagine any artist admitting to like limiting their artistic choices to oblige, you know, protesters, like religious protesters or anything. So it's, yeah, in Sweden we want to be, everyone wants to be on the barricade and make brave choices, but yeah, that's where we are in Sweden right now.
Can you bring us a perspective from the non-polarized country?
Is this on?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, I don't know if I can or I can't. Yeah, hello everybody. It's the end of a long day, really, of a weekly meeting. We'll try and keep it simple, if simple's possible. We're very diverse as a group. We're also very diverse inside us. Each of us, we're very diverse inside us. So, which bit of me would speak, I don't know. I work in two different environments, so context is obviously necessary to a conversation such as this one. I work in two different contexts. I work in the Netherlands, but I work primarily internationally. So I'll have to say something, two different things. The Netherlands, as we've been pretty neoliberal for about 15 years now, and I think that that's had a huge impact on how artists approach their work. The glorious image of the great wave of Dutch theatre comes still very much from the 80s and partially the 90s. Amsterdam, for anyone who's interested, the Mickery a long time ago. The referencing is still very old. The good old days when artists made shit and people were inspired by it. Since a few years, many artists are very much aware of the question of their own continuity, just their viability as artists in quite a tough environment, which has, we've unfortunately seen a slight taking off of the sharper edges in what artists make. If you're fortunate enough to have 4-year funding, it looks great, but then you build structures around 4-year funding. You live in constant fear of losing 4-year funding because you build a life around 4-year funding. So the fear of losing your 4-year funding becomes very dominant in some choices that you might be making. So practical issues become very, very important. It's also generational. A lot of people who've been making work for 10, 20, 30 years, mid-career artists and so on. The idea of artistic freedom is very much impacted by the politics of the last 10, 15 years. Of course, that's broad basketing all artists in the Netherlands. Of course, there are exceptions, but it's difficult to avoid a feeling of pragmatism entering the conversation around what people make. And so people back different horses. They're either getting into issues around specific issues that are artists, so technology, gender, identity, but at the same time, there's a great awareness of all eyes upon you. There's a certain exposure, which is, of course, the whole point about theatre. But what kind of exposure, who's listening, is kind of freaky, kind of scary for many artists at the moment. It's a tough moment. So around what people choose to do in that is often impacted greatly by a certain pragmatism. I'll leave that there. I'm not an expert on the Netherlands, although I worked there for 20 years, but I actually work primarily internationally, which is then quite a different context. I have a festival environment for my curating work, and we've seen the various waves of curating. So 10 years ago, there was kind of a flocking effect in festivals, international festivals. We were tending to flock towards certain artists that was tended to acquire kind of transnational visibility within a European environment, and therefore it was becoming very visible within a non-European environment as well, beyond Europe. COVID has impacted hugely, but to be honest, I think that was under pressure anyway. What we're seeing at the moment is not yet clear, but in terms of trends, at the moment, I feel that there's kind of a breaking up again of the idea of there being a collectivity necessarily around festivals. People are very much looking again at the communities within which they work. This is impacting a lot of the work that artists are making. So the audience becomes again a primary factor in what's being made. So artists, of course, make work they wish to make. It's a huge amount of work to make anything. So this asks a big investment of an artist. So they feel strongly about what they're making, but in the back of their minds, again, a certain awareness, maybe a bit more than in the past. Who is it for? What are the nature of audiences, and within the people in this room, the nature of audience, that's very variable still, from country to country. I saw in the press, German theatre, French theatre. French theatre, my favourite joke was I've never seen a piece of French theatre that was too short. You know, it was a very easy joke, you know, but in a sense that they go in a way that the Netherlands, the Dutch, don't. There is a distinction, dramaturgical distinctions, how you build inner structures and so on. In terms of theming, though, I don't know where to start because it's so diverse, it's so disparate, and I think that you need to get into, and I'm looking through the other end of the telescope, as a curator, who exactly am I curating for? I curating Groningen. So my starting point is not what's happening within artists' imagination. My starting point is what's happening in the imagination of the audience, in the place that I'm curating into, in that movement.
Yeah, thanks. Is this okay? Okay. So yeah, I come from Slovenia, and maybe it's good to kind of give a little bit of context what that means in terms of, Slovenia being a very small country. There's a lot of variety within the theatre and performing arts scene, and it basically has three layers. There is the institutional and the city theatres. Then there is the independent scene, and there is the dance scene. And there are a lot of intertwining between the three of them because of the scale of Slovenia. But there's also very big differences in the way they function and how they are also treated on an institutional level and how they are supported. And another thing that really defines it is that things are very, very much centralized. If the national, like if the institutional scene
Papa, you need to move the mic a little. They can't hear you in the back.
So if like the institutional scene still has a distribution over all the major Slovenian cities, the independent scene basically just exists in Ljubljana. And in recent years, there's a small development where there's an organization also working in Maribor that has gotten structural funding. But in other cities in Slovenia, it's virtually independent, or it's very much merged to community and amateur scene. So this really defines like how big your audience pool is and how big your touring pool is, or where you can actually show the work. And like I said, there are big discrepancies between also support that is given to institutional theatres and the support that is given to independent theatres and the dance scene, which is getting really peanuts, doesn't really have a structure at all. Contemporary dance within the country doesn't have a space of its own, so it's kind of completely marginalized. The independent scene is somewhere in between, and it functions, it has like structural funding, 4-year funding, but within that, I fear what Mark was also saying, that with 4-year structural funding is also this fear of, it's never to be taken for granted, and it can change overnight if the government changes, which we've seen in the pandemic times where we got the right-wing government and the right-wing Ministry of Culture, and many of the organizations that were there for like decades, or in the case of Play for 50 years, were cut from funding within a year. So this is like the context in which we work and operate, and like the budgets between the institutional and the independent are like, we're talking like 20 to 30 times smaller. But there is a lot of sharing in terms that the independent scene can offer, and has always worked in a way that it offers space for exploration, for more experimental work, that it really tries to cater also to those spaces that institution and also educational system doesn't offer. So I think a lot of these production houses, we don't have companies, we have production houses that work with artists and directors. And saying directors, we have a very, in the education and institutional scene, the theatre in Slovenia is very much based from directors-based theatre. Independent scene tries to overcome that and tries to give space to like new formats, tries to work in a more egalitarian way, and offers support for people to do that. In terms of thematics, I think all of these things that I'm describing structurally are then also taken into what the scope of the themes and topics that come out. In the pandemics, I think what was really, really prominent was actually the precarization of the workers' conditions and artistic workers' conditions. Because in the last year it became virtually impossible to exist as an independent actor or an independent maker. We used to have, when I started working, there was quite a lot of actors and makers that were still working on a freelance basis. Now majority of them had to find positions in institutions, and then they work on their off projects on the independent scene. What is happening in the last years is that there's a lot of like the more interdisciplinary approaches are actually coming from the visual parts of the scene, the visual artists, who are kind of more courageous into venturing out into the performance art scene and doing various experiments and there's been a lot of interesting work that's happened in that scope, and we've been supporting quite a bit of that. And the other theme that I think has also come out of the recent years is like gender issues. There was a lot of work that was made around violence of women and feminist issues. Yes, but this is a really broad brush strokes because it's very diverse and it's really varies. But maybe these are like the things that I've noticed in the past few years.
I was really struck with what you said, Ulricha, about the erosion of the arm's length principle, or the slight undermining of that. I think that's something that we've seen in the UK to a certain extent, perhaps not fully to that extent, but this idea that during the pandemic we had something called the Cultural Recovery Fund, and the artists and organisations who were receiving money to this fund were encouraged to publicly voice their gratitude for this gift that the government had given them to sort of keep the industry from afloat during this time. I'd quite like to ask, to start with you, but also to open up the question to all of the panellists about the concept of artistic risk, and if some of the factors that we've been discussed, like you were saying about the 4-year funding, or the worry about the loss of the 4-year funding is impacting on artists' ability to take risks, or and how you define risk. Also, I mean, there are different ways of looking at this, but I'd like to talk about the concept of risk in these contexts, in the times post-pandemic, and how you see, or if you see a shift in maybe what artists are willing or able to say, or whether in terms of safety or risk, in terms of the forms that they're adopting. If you have some thoughts on this, I'd be interested to hear.
I'm not an expert, but I think it's difficult to pinpoint what risks you can afford. Well, our institutions are quite safe because they have funding from both their cities and their regions. Depends on like who's in charge, of course, of the city after the last election. But I think they can be quite daring and critical. But we've also had both playwrights and directors who have been threatened or lost their job. So I guess that's, I mean, like we've seen in like Hungary, Poland, Russia, long before that, the politicians will, for some reason, cancel an artistic director's contract and put someone of their choice who is not experienced in performing arts at all, or who they can trust to, rent the space out to family ballets instead of doing like contemporary new drama, for instance. True example. Yeah, so it's hard, and I think also now we're still, the Me Too movement was it started very big in Sweden. We have, after the theater and performing protests, we had all kinds of professions like female lawyers, ambulance staff, military, doctors. It was very like almost all different fields, rose to the issue, and we thought things were going to change. And just recently now, things like juridical things, what do you call it? Like in court, like someone, a woman who is kind of a well-known woman had named a well-known cultural journalist in a closed group during the Me Too movement, when people gathered in close groups. And this spread, and she has now been evicted for ärekränkning, like ruining his career, or like I don't know the word in English.
Defamation.
Sorry?
Defamation.
Yeah. Yeah, so she was actually evicted for that and has to pay a fine. So it's like, where do we have the space to really speak the truth, and what kind of truth? I mean, of course, the sexual abuse, yes, that's very serious for a person to be accused of, but yeah, I'm sorry, I'm a bit dystopic, but yeah, I think the space is shrinking, definitely, even in Sweden.
About risk, it's really tricky, I think, because what's risky to one person is not risky to another person, and so there's huge disparity here. In the Netherlands, we kind of have an environment which, like, everything's okay. And if I look back over the years, I've been quite surprised at what's upset people. We presented things which are frankly way more physical than anything you could probably present in the UK, I think, if I understand for instance, without assuming too much. It's quite on the edge, like full, like up to pornographic acts, consenting, very extreme behaviours on stage, and none of it seems to cause much of a ripple, as much as people's interpretation of things. The most upsetting thing that I've actually presented in all these years has been a fluffy puppet musical, which wasn't serious enough for an opener. I mean, I thought it would be fun, because we were always so serious, and it was fluffy puppets singing about singing in harmony was better than singing in unison. Pretty innocent stuff. And you know, they loved it on the Wiener Festival, and they loved it in Copenhagen. They hated it in Groningen, because it wasn't serious enough. And that was risky in a way which I'd never been able to imagine in advance. So risk is strange. I think also I would slightly switch it to the right to fail. I think it's really important to look at, maybe, because that's also coming from the 4-year funding issue. Artists are supposed to take risk, but what does it look like? That's a challenge for many artists. What does risk look like? What's the context? We had a production, Quarantine from Manchester, who we know well. We presented them numerous times. For anybody who doesn't know, Quarantine, they make very contemporary work, often in very local environments, in and around Manchester, village halls and school settings, and now increasingly on the international festival circuit. And they set out to make a piece 5 years ago with 2 sisters from Ireland telling everything they could remember. And they had to stop the process because, well, it just started going wrong between the 2 sisters, and then it didn't happen. It was in our book. And I asked Richard Gregory, the director, to do the opening speech of the festival about the artist's right to fail. The fact that you can fail, that it is part of our business. That was something I was very happy to be able to lead on as an opening speech. In a society, it's not just theatre, society in general becomes increasingly more punitive around the idea of failure. Younger people feel very much a pressure to never fail. That's a big issue in society. So I think in terms of risk, we'd have to look at the right to fail and how you would contextualise that locally in funding terms or whatever. I'll stop.
In terms of risk-taking, when I was thinking now which angle to approach this from, and I think for me, when I look back at what was happening in the 90s in Slovenia and early 2000, I would say there was a lot more risk-taking and the scene was very much more progressive than it is now. But I wouldn't say that that's because public space is necessarily closing down and people are not susceptible to that anymore. But I think it's more that it's just this like much more connected to just like existential reasons of how much time there is to develop things, of how much money there is to develop things. I would certainly, probably partially the polarization. I think there's also a lot of pressure in our context that for a lot of topics, people don't feel that they are equipped with enough knowledge to actually tackle them, because a lot of times the Western discourse is so dominant and so far ahead that there's like just a feeling that however you're going to approach a topic, you will fail because you just don't have access to enough knowledge. So I think that is also a thing that kind of pulls people back in terms of like what topics they address, the way they address them, and how far they're willing to push them.
Barbara, I wanted to go back to something you said a little earlier about the precarity, and I think this also ties into the idea of the right to fail. Again, talking from a UK perspective, one of the big challenges that we face at the moment is that we have a crisis of housing, and people cannot. It's very difficult for artists to live in London, our most sort of thriving artistic city. That it's people are being pushed to the periphery and indeed out of London altogether. And increasingly we're facing a situation where it is a much narrower pool of people who are able to make art at all, but it's becoming increasingly the preserve of people who have access to some perhaps independent wealth or have a salaried jobs, and this is having a real significant knock-on effect on the kind of art that's being made. And so the pool of people who are able to fail, who have that right and that ability. So I'd just like to open that up again and to hear if that is also something that is becoming the case in your respective scenes, and I guess how can this be addressed as artists? How can this be sort of what solutions can there be to this kind of precarity? How can we make their life, if not more stable, then at least to prevent this kind of narrowing? Your thoughts on this matter would be welcome. Thank you. You can fix it.
I have to reflect upon a moment a few years ago. It was after several years that there'd been war in Syria, still is. So several years into the war, we had a Syrian director called Omar Abshada presenting work on Nordson, and I had at the same time a group of mainly American senior figures from the field there as a group meeting on the festival. We had a 3-day meeting. They were really keen to meet various artists. So we did a session with Omar Abshada, and so of course, America is the land of dollars. Dollars you need to buy to make stuff happen. And so at a certain moment, of course, inevitably Omar is asked what are the consequences of the war for you. He still lived in Damascus. Many members of the company had moved to other places in Europe, but he still lived in Damascus. And he said, well, I learned one thing. I learned that theatre is really cheap to make. You can make theatre when you're really, really desperately poor, when you don't have anything. You can make theatre. So you need money if you want costumes or decors or music to be specially composed, or you need money for that. But actually theatre as a form, you can make with pretty much no money at all. And of course everyone went rather quiet at this point. We had to think about it. And of course we come to the question of the choices we're making within the theatre as an art form, we acquire certain images of how it needs to happen. I think what you touched upon is precarity within people's living circumstances as well. But I think it is maybe useful also to perhaps separate those two things out, the one from the other, because in one country, 10,000 euros is a huge production budget, and in another country, 500,000 will barely get you past the first couple of weeks. And so, but when it comes to how people live and experience, you come, yes, of course, people from a more padded background or a more secure environment, that perhaps will play a role, and that of course is as diverse as the horizon.
Yeah, I think I'll just continue in the direction that Mark started. Like I said, precarity is very much an issue in an existential way, but it's also, in a way, it also now becomes such a strength that you never work with an environment that was never used to heavy subsidies, and that people are used to actually working with very little. And there's also, we had this many conversations with some colleagues of mine about, the forces of the market and the necessity to tour. And the fact is that there's a lot of hunger for touring and for exposure within Slovenian artists, but it's not even that hunger exists because they are forced, or they know that this is how they're going to make a living, because it's not sustainable in a way that we don't have a company model. But it's just a hunger for some sort of exposure, recognition of the work that is being done, like with mostly enthusiasm and very little funding. I'm speaking here, of course, of the independent sector. So there's also like this precarity in opportunities, and this is also becoming a thing that I think about a lot in this world where we're talking about, okay, we need to slow down, the market isn't really viable anymore, and it's not working, and it hasn't been working. But how do you then create these opportunities, and how do you just explain this to the people that have never had these opportunities? And there's like a very intrinsic urge for that, and I don't have an answer to that, but I am asking myself this, and how do you work with it in this context then?
We've been speaking from our individual context across this panel, and I think it'd be nice to to talk collectively about the European experience as well, including the UK. I think one of the things that we were invited to talk about on this panel and to maybe dig into is this idea of what topics are hot or floating to the surface of theatre makers' collective processes at the moment, and I think theatre is not always maybe the most fast responsive medium. It would be interested to have your thoughts on what you think within Europe are the most pressing topics, and how do you see this maybe evolving over the next year or so in work that you maybe know that's being made or being thought about at the moment. What do you feel like are the topics of the moment, if it's possible to even to talk on these terms? But I would be interested to know what you think.
I think what I see with a lot of theaters are going back to the ensemble theater instead of so the playwrights equity is upset that no one is ordering new plays from a playwright, because you want to work with the ensemble and you work maybe with documentary material, and it's like a devising. That's not a new trend, but I think it's growing even stronger, and I see a lot of based on true stories and also like pure documentary, but that the style of the theater is also very free. Like you change roles, you change gender, you change. It's just almost like when people talk about how fantastic the community theater was in the 70s. That's kind of what I imagine is kind of coming back. It's like a collective. It's very powerful and full of hope and energy. Yeah, so I think that's absolutely something. I think I lost my thread, so please fill in.
Come on, Barbara.
I don't consider that I know enough about like European theatrical landscape that I would say like what are the topics that are there now. But I think I can only speak for what I think I would want to see or I think was necessary, and I think that for me I really like this sort of like imagination of like other possible futures that I think we've been valuing in this dystopia for I don't know how long now, and kind of dissecting the society that we live in, and I would really like to see like reimagination of like possible futures or yeah. And even, you know, I was thinking now when we were watching the show from Orwell 1984, and I was thinking, so, like, wouldn't it be great if, like, for once I would be watching, like, Ursula K. Le Guin and, like, her possibilities of future narratives or, like, future societies on stage, maybe? Yeah, but, like, something that maybe what he was saying is kind of, like, bringing back the community and, like, lessening the gap of polarization, and if not that, then at least like, yeah, like multiplying perspectives. Because I also feel that a lot of times when we go to this level of European or international, we are forced to just go to the lowest common denominator, so that you know that we can culturally translate things, and cultural translation is a difficult thing in itself. So how to approach that is yet another huge topic. But yeah, I do feel that this lowest common denominator is just not working.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. So just very obviously diverse. And I think artists are quite busy with often artists about those with what exactly that means, diversity. We've gone through a few years of rather simplistic thinking about what diversity would be or should be, what it looks like. I think a lot of artists are now looking to drop down a level, kind of look for something less black and white, less simplistic, a bit more nuanced. The fundamental nature. What do we mean by diversity? Diversity of what? Get away from simplicities. I think I probably could detect at the moment. There's been a few years within which there's been quite a lot of pressure, certainly in the Netherlands, I think elsewhere, to have purpose within theatre, that it serves some kind of social purpose as a legitimacy to theatre happening at all. What's it for? What's theatre for when you have so many things? And there's been a few years of like, oh, we serve this purpose or that purpose with the work that is made. I think there's a re-questioning whether theatre needs to serve purpose in this overt way or not. Of course, it can obviously always serve purpose, but does it have to? Can it just be theatre? And what do you mean by that? In the notes for the meeting, interestingly, I don't know who wrote, but it was like many artists are busy with the issue of climate change, which is of course a good thing. I think I struggle with the of course a good thing in this sense, in this context. I think that the idea that we're going to look to artists to stop the planet burning up, it's kind of ambitious. I do think that it's a problem that we share with all of humanity, not just the theatre community, obviously. And what I notice is that people, rather than trying to make a piece about climate change, will include elements of narrative around that include climate change as an element of a narrative rather than being a foundation of a narrative, as a reflection of the world as people experience it. So these kind of, it's too yeah, you can't do it on the stage, but it's there all the time. Of course, the kind of climate change is now shifted to organisations, theatres, festivals, all of how we live our lives. So in these sense, the movements, I think, are quite reflective of other movements within society. It's the idea of theatre as a separate bit of society is under pressure, and as I think that a lot of artists are busy with that question. How is theatre as an environment? We understand it's not an us and them, it's not a separate thing to society, within society, and what's happening in my life with the rest of it as well. I'm sorry, it's a bit vague.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, I think also looking at the European perspective, I think what is necessary to deal with, and which is also happening, is processing the colonial heritage that is European, and the racism, and yeah, so it's a lot about deconstructing, seeing a play that we thought was good, and then you see it later and you have learned things, and you know, we have like a native population in Sweden, and we never learned in school what has historically been done to them, you know, as I'm sure a lot of, you know, we're living in different countries and we all have hidden secrets that we need to get out. So I think also a challenge to bring a solution to the table is also to fight against the class aspect of who can become an artist, because people are moving from different continents, and we have refugees, and we have immigrants, and second and third generation immigrants, and to choose an artistic path, even in Sweden, where the schools are free, the universities are free, but you will still be, you know, in debt, because you have to live while you study, and then you don't know if you're gonna get a job, and you know, but if you come from you know, a poor childhood, that's not at all what you can picture. So I think we are missing out on a lot of fantastic artists, because we have to figure out new ways to bring everyone who has the calling into the arts, and then what kind of art do we want? And I don't think at all that we are there, but I think it's what we're moving towards, at least, or trying to.
Thank you. We have a relatively small amount of time left. I would just like to open it up to the floor. If anyone has a relatively concise question that they would like to ask the panel, then now is the time to do so. Yes, please. Is there a microphone at all? I'll give you. Yes, please.
They will not hear you without the mic, so I suggest that you bring this up.
Can you come here?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Well, my question is about refugee and immigrators. I believe you receive a lot of refugees and immigrators in last decade, or last decades actually, not one decade. I wonder whether those people involved in any theatrical activities, or at least do they make any impact on the theatre in Europe, or do not? If they do, what they do? If they are, if not, why not? Thank you.
Yeah, I can start with yes, not enough, but yes, we do have a lot of really visible and successful artists, directors, playwrights, artistic directors who are has immigrated themselves. We have a lot of population from Iran, for instance, and Chile and Argentina came in the 80s, 90s, and now the last years, obviously Afghanistan, Syria, and now Ukraine. And yeah, I can't say that we are doing enough, or that, but yeah, I was a curator. There was a Swedish theme at Heidelberger Stückemarkt in Germany this spring, and I suggested. They wanted me to suggest playwrights and plays and productions, and I gave, like, we had done like excerpts from 10 Swedish playwrights that I think represent, you know, the different styles of plays and writing. And this artistic director, he was like, "Oh, you have a lot of immigrant playwrights," and I had not, you know, it's like because they are artists in their own, you know, in their own right. So I think also a problem with it, that goes also for, like, you work with queer artists or immigrant artists that that you don't expect them to only make art based on their private experiences. You can just be a playwright or an actor and be you know, from another continent or queer or any minority, but so I guess yeah, I feel hopeful for that we're including them, but we need to do more, and the universities, like, where you start your path as an artist your whole life. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the Dutch and Netherlands, they're very pragmatic, practical people. They just don't want to be bored in a theatre. So who's telling them the story, they don't mind. It can be anybody. We have quite a broad range of people making work. Some of them are refugees recently, some of them are refugees from a long time ago. That's something which has changed working internationally. I said I work internationally 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Working internationally meant literally people from the other side of borders and so on. Of course, international now, most communities in the world are fundamentally internationalized over recent years, or even small cities, big cities. So our own local community is fundamentally more international, made up of many people from different extractions, different reasons for them to be there. We, you know, depending on the curator, the presenter, the producer, some have a desire to proactively work with refugees. Others just work with refugees if they're present within society and as part of our society, our community. And in that we vary, but I think it's just at the end of the day, it's quite a, you know, it's a busy consumerist world. People wish to be interested, told a good story in a fine way, and that can actually be, I think, from just about anybody.
We have a very shitty integration policy in our country, so there is very little collaborations of this sort, unfortunately. But there are some, again, there were collaborations done, and again, this is usually done from the side of NGOs, but there's also been work done by Mladinsko Theatre that have been working, they haven't put people on stage, but they have been working in intense research, and they've made a performance called The Game, which is about how immigrants are treated on the way, and about this game of life and death they play, and that's been quite acclaimed performance, and I think one that's been kind of like dealing with this topic in a very good way. But I think we have a long way to go in terms of inclusion politics, or how to actually include people that are coming to Slovenia as refugees and give them space also in the arts.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone wants to ask the panel, before we wrap things up. Okay then. Is there any sort of closing statement that you think that, again, this has been a huge topic and a big sort of sphere of discussion, but is there anything you think that is sort of valuable to add about the place that we are now, and like we talked about imagined futures, maybe that's a nice place to end. Maybe can we have a potted imaginary future, or a place of hope to end on?
I'll be extremely short, based on topics that have been up on the recent international conferences I've been to. I just want to say, don't be afraid of AI. Use it in your administration. Don't be afraid of TikTok. It's fantastic. The young generation are craving live experiences, and they are activists, and there is so much hope.
That feels like a good place. I think that feels like a good note to end on. So I would like to thank all of the panelists today for their contributions. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion, and thank you again to our hosts for this showcase and their hospitality. And thank you.